to even do a podcast about esports and video games. 15 or 20 years ago, probably nobody would imagine that something like, NHL or NBA could be an esport. And even a lot of the games that are really popular in esports right now, like League of Legends and Dota 2 and stuff like that, probably weren't even anybody's imagination, 20 years ago that those games could even exist.
No, absolutely not. And as I was going through my master's, I didn't even think of esports, and I grew up in esports. And so coming out of sports psychology master's, I defaulted into the traditional sports setting, and it still hadn't crossed my mind. And it's kind of strange how someone in esports doesn't think about taking sports psychology into esports. It's just because there is that big disconnect. And so it was like one day I was just at work and I was sitting there. I was like, what am I doing? There's esports and I love esports. I know the industry. I can take the sports psychology world into esports. And so it's just that connection isn't there yet. So I had that epiphany moment for sure.
Yeah. You said you have a bit like the industry. Is that just through like your own kind of, I guess, childhood and adolescence of playing video games, or did you have any like professional ventures in the video game world? Or
no, so for me, mostly it was I got into it with my older cousins when Halo first came out way back when. I was much younger. I think I was 9 or 10 or so when it first came out. My cousins were all in their late teens, and so I started playing games or trying to compete with people in a very young age. And then as time goes on, I started playing different games like Call of Duty, World of Warcraft, League of Legends. Pretty much you name it, I've played it. And so I grew up as esports was developing, I grew up in that environment. I never played competitively or anything, but I always played as competitive as I could. So I was never a casual gamer. I don't like single player games. It has to be competitive. Mm-hmm. And so then, quite truthfully, my biggest passion in life is understanding human expertise and what creates it. And so when I went into my master's program, I wasn't necessarily thrilled about sports. Sports wasn't my passion. All my cohort, they loved sports. They were involved in competitive sports in some way or another. I just loved human expertise. And so that's why I went that route. And that's why I also defaulted into traditional sports. But then when I finally made that connection, I was like, esports, duh, let's go. Right.
I know when I kind of like, I go through different degrees and stuff that, people have of sports psychology or whatever it's called. And, some are called sports psychology. Some are called human performance psychology or performance psychology. I think I like the human performance part of it, that kind of term better than just sports psychology, because Absolutely. It's really a performance as a human. And, a lot of the things, this is kind of I guess a drum that I beat often is, the things that we try and work with athletes, whether esports or traditional sports, they're life lessons, for all aspects of your life, really, when it comes with concentration, dealing with frustration, film study and, all those kind of stuff. Those are all takeaways for just life in general. So I really like the term, human performance psychology or performance psychology instead of just sports psychology.
Absolutely. So my master's program specifically is a master in science of performance psychology. So my professors recognize that the performance domains aren't isolated to just sports, right? So you've got music. Some people in my cohort were professional dancers, for example. A couple of people from my cohort also went into like leadership / corporate training, because those are high stress, high demand environments that you have to produce results in. So you need somebody that can teach you how to perform well under those conditions. So the university I went to recognized that it wasn't just sports, but it was performance in general. And so that kind of opens up the door for me to go into esports as well, because it didn't limit my view. I'm not stuck to traditional sports. I can open up those doors and go into esports, for example. And everybody was kind of free to do what they want because they weren't limited by the word sport.
Yeah, it's interesting when you think about it too. I mean, I was kind of thinking about this earlier, was when you kind of compare, traditional sports to esports, and you look at like how important the physical and mental aspect of the games are to each. Like for, sports, you can argue it's 50-50 or 60-40 or something along those lines. But I would feel like for esports or video gaming, it's predominantly a mental game. It could be like 80-20 or 90-10. You probably have a better idea of what the actual ratio is, but it's just kind of me thinking back to me playing video games. It's not so much the physical aspect of it. It's the mental aspect that kind of separates, the best from just the good.
Yeah. So it's like, if you look at a American football game, for example, if you're say 5'5" and scrawny and you're up against someone that's 6'5" and huge, like, you're going to lose. No matter how mentally tough you are, you're going to lose because they're going to just run you over. In esports, you don't have that same level of limitations. You could be the scrawniest person in the room and just destroy an entire elite set of bodybuilders who've been training in esports and traditional sports, because you're right. It's like 95% mental. And then you got your fine motor skills. And there is a lot of physical component to how fast your brain can process information and stuff like that. But it's by no means limited by physical capabilities like traditional sports are, which makes my job more interesting, because in like the sport or performance psychology world, you get to deal more with that cognitive side of things.
I know you kind of mentioned that, the physical aspect doesn't play too much of a role, but I always kind of wondered how much I don't know if you had any experience or thoughts on this, but how much does like the gaming posture of a player, does that affect the performance at all? Or is that not something that you've really kind of heard of, I guess? Am I just speaking hot air here?
No. I've definitely heard of it. I don't know how much it impacts your performance, but it does hugely impact your health, right? So there's one guy that I'm friends with, and he focuses on ergonomics and like posture training for esports athletes, because in esports athletes, you tend to have a head tilt. So your head is pushed forward, your shoulders are rolled in, and your spine is kind of curved. So although it might not be impacting your ability to perform in game, it's definitely impacting your overall health. And if your overall health gets impacted, then down the line, maybe your in-game performance gets impacted because you're not getting proper sleep because your back hurts, or you're not getting activity because your neck hurts, or whatever it might be. So it doesn't immediately impact your performance, but if your body gets torqued out of position, then that could impact you long run.
Yeah. And I would, I'm kind of thinking of like, it would also kind of just help you, I guess, tolerate longer durations of training as well. So, I kind of thought about this earlier too, just thinking about the whole comparison of esports and sports, just in general. You have a track and field athlete who, runs 100-meter dash or something. You can only practice a 100-meter dash, at full strength, maybe a couple times, 5 times. I'm not a track and field runner, so I don't know the exact number there. But, like somebody that's into esports, you can sit down and play, Fortnite or League of Legends or FIFA or something for, 6 to 8 hours straight. You see all the guys streaming on Twitch, for such a long period of time, that I feel like posture is somewhat of a factor in that, to allow you to go those extra long distances in order to get all the training in that you need.
Yeah, exactly. And also, even on that point, to take it a step further, in traditional sports, when you have that physical component, you're kind of limited the amount you can train based on how far your body can go. So, like say you have an extremely rigorous training session yesterday. Today, you wake up extremely sore. You can barely stand up on your feet. You can't train that day. Your body is like shut down. So it's forcing you into a state of rest, right? In esports, because there isn't that physical component, the fatigue isn't as tangible, and people perceive that they can continue to play, right? Like this is the way that most esport athletes perceive it, is that the best way to improve is to put more hours into the game. And since there isn't that physical fatigue that shuts their body down, it's all in the mental state. They just keep on pushing and keep on grinding. And that's why you see esport athletes drop out of the professional scene so early. Like, there's no other sport, even like as your body's deteriorating, you can still go past 22 years of age. But esports, you're seeing people retiring at 21, 22 because they don't really perceive that fatigue that's happening, and their brain burns out. Their brain doesn't want to continue to push because they've been pushing for so long. And so that's like a little nuance or a difference between traditional sports and esports when it comes to understanding fatigue in the two.
Yeah, and I would guess that the term rest day has a different meaning in esports maybe than it does in traditional sports. Like in traditional sports, when you're doing a rest day, I'm thinking about me, training, for a sporting event or something. A rest day is I literally just shut down my body. I do maybe a couple stretches and that's about it. Is rest day a talked about thing in the esports community? Is it something that teams do, or is it because there's such a, I guess, an emphasis on sort of like the quote unquote grind that you talked about that, they just try to cram in as many hours as they can?
Yeah, it's a little bit tricky to answer this question in a sense because anybody that's in my position is trying to force rest days onto people. For example, I was working with one player, and I could tell, like, from seeing the way he was acting, his skill progression, everything, I could just tell that he was tired and burnt out of the game. So I was trying to force that rest day on him, but there's so much resistance because internally and intrinsically, their default setting is to play the game. So if they're going for a rest means playing the game. So you see, it's kind of like a circular thing. There is they're fatigued on the game. I force them to take a rest, but rest in their mind, their default setting for rest means playing games.
Right.
And so it's very difficult to get an esport athlete to take a break from the game. You really have to try and prove to them that not playing anymore is the best method to make them better. And then I'll often see when I get them to take a break from playing games, their immediate reaction is to go play a different game. That's what rest is. If they're playing Fortnite and I want them to take a break from Fortnite, they're going to go play League of Legends because that's a break. Mm-hmm. And is that effective? Should they be not playing video games, period? Is just switching games enough to give them that break? And since esports is really new, it's very hard to determine that answer right now.
Mm-hmm. I know. Yeah. One thing I was thinking about as you're saying that is just, how much of a spike in popularity esports has, recently. It's just kind of such a bang that, all these new concepts that are in traditional sports are almost kind of getting shoved into esports in a sense because there's such a demand, I think, for mental performance consultants or sports psychologists, whatever term people are, people use, but there's such a demand for it now that it's almost like it's almost playing a bit of catch up and trying to, get the esports community integrated with, the principles that help, traditional sport athletes, I guess.
Yeah. And just to build on that point more, it's like someone coming from traditional sports or somebody in a position like mine, we often do try to pull useful tricks and tips and training mechanisms from traditional sports and then plug them into esports. And largely that's because we don't have better tools yet because the research isn't there to back it up. It's starting to get there. It's starting to emerge. Like if I was to go to do some research, I could find some stuff, but it's not nearly as robust. Mm-hmm. And the issue with that often comes down to context and structure, right? Like the context and circumstances of an esport athlete are vastly different than a traditional sports athlete. And their structure of growing up is also vastly different. So their ability to react to things or the way they react to things are different, not necessarily better or worse, but they're just different. And we have to kind of respect that difference. I'll give you kind of an example here. Like if I was working with a traditional sport athlete and they had performance anxiety, and I was working with an esport athlete and they had performance anxiety, I could try and steal my techniques from traditional sports and plug it into that esports athlete and see if that works. But there's a very unique culture and community within esports. And so, for example, the reason why I bring this up is this is an actual case that I worked on, and their performance anxiety was almost exclusively driven because they drank a lot of energy drinks. Mm-hmm. And when you put somebody into a intensely competitive, stressful, and demanding situation on top of overloaded on caffeine and sugar, that's going to just start triggering jitters. Those jitters are going to be perceived as anxiety. Anxiety is going to cause performance anxiety, and then you're going to have a shutdown, right? So I have to be keenly aware of what kind of things esports athletes are doing before that is causing these issues. Where in traditional sports, if I see performance anxiety, my initial go-to isn't to assume that they've been pretty much overdosing on caffeine, because that's just not something that's within that context. Mm-hmm. And so the same issue is happening to both of them, but I have to understand the context of their environments as well.
Yeah. And that kind of brought up a point that I was thinking about too, was when you compare, a standard, sport athlete where they grow up and they're kind of in the spotlight, throughout childhood and adolescence and, so on and so forth until they hit the pros and everything. They're always kind of in the spotlight. Whereas for a lot of esports athletes, I would assume that, especially because the field is so new, that growing up, they didn't really have the spotlight on them as a, esports athlete, for example, or, they weren't billed as an esports star when they were 10 or 11 years old. Like, someone who's my age right now that, especially when I was 10 or 11 years old, there was never really any talk of these kind of things. And so I feel like there's, just to kind of talk about how you pull in things from the traditional sports world and you talk a bit about pressure. That's something that kind of jumped out of my mind. And I don't know if you've experienced that yourself with working with some of your athletes, is that they never really were exposed to a pressure like this growing up, some sort of that kind of media hype for lack of a better word.
Yeah, no, that honestly nailed it right in the head. Because when you think of traditional sports, you have parental support, you have like a school structure that they grew up in playing soccer and football and badminton or whatever it might be, all the way through the early years of school. They get in leagues through junior, senior high. They have that coaching staff. They have support teaching them how to handle this. They're thrown into competitions and they're learning to deal with this stress and pressure as they're developing. And that gives them the tools to transfer it into like a collegiate or varsity setting and take it professional. Through their development years, they've learned how to cope with that. Whereas esports, it's kind of like a rags to riches situation where you're absolutely nobody. You're just sitting alone or playing with your team at a LAN center or where it might be. And then all of a sudden, boom, you're in the professional scene. You haven't developed the same level of coping mechanisms because there isn't that structure. There isn't that support given to you. And that's probably going to be one of the key components to esports in the future is kind of getting that development scene going so that kids in the early ages have the structure where they can learn to cope with those pressures so that you don't become a 20-year-old professional League of Legends player that's having anxiety breakdowns and depression because there's so many demands on them. But yeah, it's exactly what you said is that traditional sports learns to deal with that pressure and esports isn't given that opportunity yet. And that's so in my position, I have to try and play catch up with some of that things is teaching people those basic coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, I'm assuming that you're kind of, I know that you co-founded an academy called the Northern Esports Academy. And I'm assuming that's kind of a bit of what you're trying to get into, the development of the esports athletes and kind of guide them through that process. Is that kind of your main goal with that?
Yeah, that's exactly that. That was one of the whole purposes of creating it. We're still in the very early stages of it. It's, as you probably know, it's very new, a new field in Canada. So there's not a whole lot of structure and things just take a very long time to get going without the financial support of like traditional sports. Mm-hmm. So our goal is to kind of get kids coming in from high schools, give them extracurriculars like learning how to play League of Legends, but we're also going to introduce other esports skills. So for example, if somebody doesn't want to play esports competitively but they love esports, they can come to the academy and learn how to be an analyst or learn how to cast games or learn how to manage a team or coach a team. So the academy is taking an approach that there's way more to esports than just playing competitively. There's careers in there that kids want to learn, so we'll give them the environment where they can learn. And then ultimately, to build on top of that, we're going to be trying to partner with local universities or universities throughout the states to try and create that funnel so that kids can maybe earn scholarships and will become a scouting ground so that universities be like, we need a new top laner for League of Legends or whatever it might be. And they can come almost window shopping at the academy and help kids reach their goals and maybe use esports as a way to pursue higher education.
Yeah, I'd assume it's probably sooner rather than later, but there's probably going to be a time where you can get a scholarship to, an NCAA school or something like that for esports. Maybe there's something like that already in NCAA or in Europe or Asia or somewhere else in the world. But I would assume that we're not too far off from that, where, a student can actually get a full ride scholarship, just like a football or basketball or hockey player could. They get a full ride scholarship for League of Legends, for example.
Yeah, there already is. So there's no necessary like collegiate or university level that is similar to NCAA or whatever it might be, but students and kids are already getting full ride scholarships. For example, one of the kids that we've been working with here, they're 16, I believe, right now, and they've already got a full ride scholarship offered to them somewhere down in the States. So it's popping up. The scholarship opportunities in Canada are very limited at the time, but in the States, there's thousands and millions of dollars worth of scholarships available and full rides for people playing esports.
Yeah, I feel like that's just a common theme, just in not only in traditional sports psychology, but just in human performance psychology in general, especially esports, is that the Canada tends to kind of lag behind a bit for the States. And I never really was able to kind of put my thumb or my fingerprint as to why that happens. It just kind of always has just been the narrative, I guess, with things.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had any thoughts of maybe why that is, or you think it's just maybe the culture, or maybe the population is just so large in the States that these things just get more traction, I guess.
I think it has to do with population density, to be honest. Like when you think of the States, you have, 51 states, and then within that you have your state level competitions, and you have your nationals or whatever it might be. So you have all these competition systems going. I'm from Alberta, and so to use Alberta as an example, we have two major cities. We got Calgary and Edmonton. Those are our only two cities. I mean, there's other little cities here, but then to compete in a provincial level, that's a lot of traveling. That's a lot of money involved. And then to compete at a national level, like imagine going from Vancouver to Montreal, that's tremendous amounts of money for a small high school or collegiate level to spend. And so because of the density or the travel times in the States, it's much easier. Plus, just there's more money, which is why Canada kind of lags behind the rest. You have to prove the system works so that we can adopt it before we waste all of our time on it, kind of thing.
Yeah. But you're living in Toronto right now, correct? So
yeah.
So I mean, if you're going to pick a spot in Canada to start an esports academy or to kind of get involved in an industry as it's beginning to grow, there's probably no better place than Toronto in GTA. I guess I should ask, is there a hub of esports in Canada? Is there a city or a region that's known as like the hub of esports? Much like, I can't even, maybe for hockey, I guess that, Toronto's like the hockey center in the world, they call it, or stuff like that. Is there something like that for esports?
Well, it's definitely not in Calgary. I'll tell you that much.
So it's not in a medicine hat. No.
No. Oh, mercy. No. That's actually, so when I was making that transition from traditional sports into esports, one of the conditions of making that transition is I had to leave Calgary. That was that was non-negotiable because it's just not possible. But to answer your question, yeah, kind of. There's 3 major cities that are doing esports right now. I can't really tell you which one is ahead of each other because they're all kind of fighting for that number 1 spot. But there's Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. So within Toronto, we've got some major tier 1 teams, and we got some of the big business and corporate side of esports hanging out around here. So they own teams in Vancouver and in Seattle, for example. And then Montreal has a bunch of teams, and then they've also got a Montreal Esports Academy. And so those 3 cities are all fighting for the number 1 spot. It seems like Toronto's now taking the lead because it's just the business side of things. So where you have the business side of things, you have the most money, and where you have the most money, you have a lot of growth stimulation. So Toronto definitely wasn't the first. I think Montreal was the first to adopt esports, but Toronto is, if they haven't taken over yet, it's going quick, which is exactly why I picked this as the city I wanted to move to, is because I kind of was thinking that this might be the future of esports in Canada.
Yeah. When you talk about like how the cities have different teams and stuff, are you referring to like I know, like, for example, the Raptors have their own esports team.
Yeah.
I guess the Leafs have theirs, I believe. I don't think the Blue Jays have theirs for MLB The Show, but is that what you're referring to for like how cities have different teams, or is there like an actual pro esports league, much like, the CFL, for example?
Yeah, so this is where it gets a little bit gray as well, because it depends on the game that you're talking about. League of Legends, for example, is still owned by whoever owns it, right? Like you can buy into the League of Legends franchise, you can put a team, you can compete. But that's not based on a city. Like in North America, for example, Professional League of Legends is in, I believe it's in LA right now. However, when you look at games like Overwatch and Call of Duty, those are geolocated franchises. So Toronto has their team, Vancouver has their teams, Seattle has their teams, Dallas has their teams, and then they travel much like they do in the NHL, where Toronto is playing against Seattle today. So we're going to go compete in Seattle's eSport arena. And if I'm not mistaken, like Toronto's Call of Duty team plays in the Maple Leaf Gardens, and Toronto's Overwatch team plays in Roy Thompson Hall.
That's pretty crazy when you think about it. That they have these hockey arenas, for example, Maple Leaf Gardens, and they're using it to play a video game, Call of Duty. I think you said for this example. It's also interesting too how they travel to different cities to play. I guess where these games are primarily played online. I guess that's just maybe to reduce any sort of lag or anything that would occur online, or is it maybe to get that kind of sporting feeling where the teams are lined up facing each other? I guess that's how the computer screens are, where the computer screens are back to back kind of thing. Is that, I guess, the general thought process behind that, or?
Yeah, I think it's kind of has to do with trying to drive like fan bases and hype. So it's like I could be cheering for a team in League of Legends like Cloud9, for example, because they're my favorite team. But they don't necessarily mean anything to me specifically, other than they're my favorite team. When you have your home team, the Toronto Call of Duty team is called Ultra. So it's like when you have Toronto Ultra, your home team playing against the Minnesota team in home base, like you get out, you go to the arena, you buy your tickets, you buy your concession, you buy your merchandise. So it's a way of like driving that hype and that excitement and support. And then also probably trying to build up a little bit of revenue with like ticket sales. Because if you're competing online, you're not making money because you're not selling tickets. You're probably not selling as much merchandise or concession because these leagues are extraordinarily expensive to buy into. I think I could be mistaken these numbers here, but I think the Call of Duty franchise for Toronto to have a team, it was $27 million. So wow. How are you going to make that back? It's if they're playing online, and you're not selling anything. You're kind of out of money, right? You can only do online advertisements. So I think this geolocate is just to try and grow the industry.
Yeah, I mean, $27 million is definitely not the first figure that jumped to my mind when you talked about buying into a league. I mean, that's absolutely crazy. Like that they're able to generate. I mean, the price is obviously justified, and they're not just picking $27 million for the heck of it. There's a reason why it's $27 million, and I think that just kind of goes to show just how popular esports is. And I know, I guess one of the lasting stigmas of video games or esports is, that there's no health benefits to it, I guess. So when you think of like an athlete, if somebody devotes their life to, playing football, at least if that doesn't work out, at least they have some sort of health benefit from it. Yeah. Some people might not see that for esports, but I know you've talked a bit about before about, how esports or video games in general can be used as an educational tool. So there is actually some, side product or byproduct benefit to playing video games rather than, just sitting aimlessly at a TV screen for 8 hours. There's actually some educational benefits to doing that.
Yeah. And it's like in traditional sports, I go up to a parent and I say, hey, I can help your kid with this, and they'll become better at soccer. And the parent is immediately on board because they intrinsically value sports because of the health benefits and maybe like the social aspect or whatever it might be. They value that. When I go up to a parent and I say, hey, this is what I do, I can make your kid better at League of Legends, they're like, I don't care, right? It's very hard to get a parent to buy into esports. And the way I've started approaching this, and this was a long learning process, so I wasn't doing this at first, but I show parents that esports is a tool to engage their kids, right? Like you have this entire generation of people that are so passionate and so invested in Fortnite and League of Legends, right? And so when you have someone that engaged on something, if you can turn that something into a tool to teach them, you immediately have them engaged in something that they're learning, right? So when I approach parents, I say, how do we turn esports into a tool to help them learn? And so then I give them examples like, through the training that we'll do, they'll be learning how to communicate. They'll be learning how to make rapid decisions. They'll be learning how to handle stress. When I'm working with them, I teach them how to goal set and plan. So that'll translate into something like if they want to become an engineer, they can plan for their future. And so we can use esports to teach them things. And so esports isn't going away, so we might as well try and get something out of it. And then also I was at a tournament in Poland for Apex, and I was even caught off guard with some of the players I saw there because they were all extremely fit. There were some huge dudes that you would think were bodybuilders. And it's just like, what's going on here, right? But it's because people are starting to realize that even though it's just video games, your brain performs better when you're healthy. So people are working out, they're eating better. And so you can kind of see that even though it's not a physical performance domain, you're still getting health benefits when it's done correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's ever an opportunity for some research to be published that shows that, some sort of moderate level of exercise is a benefit to, esports performance, that making that direct causal relation, I guess, I think that would just be like absolutely huge for getting the buy-in for some of the parents, like you mentioned, that maybe aren't on board with esports or don't see the value in it. And kind of, if you can relate esports performance to, gym performance or exercise performance, then it kind of, I think it gives it a little bit more validation as a legitimate, career option, for example.
Exactly. And research has already backed this for the most part that your brain is impacted by so many things, right? Like by your sleep. If you're sleep deprived, you think slower and make more mistakes. If you're not eating correctly, your brain's a little bit clogged up. Like if you have too much sugar, you can't think straight. If you're not fit and healthy, your brain doesn't process at full capacity. Like there's all these things that your brain needs in order to process information accurately and fast. And since esports is such a hugely mental and cognitive game, any little change in your life that impacts your ability to think is going to impact your ability to play. Mm-hmm. So there's no other sport that compares to how much information is happening than in esports, right? Like if you're playing League of Legends, you have to track 9 other players. You have to track all of their abilities, their ability cooldowns. You have to track the macro and micro play. You have to control your own player. There's just a tremendous amount of information coming on. So even like a 1 or 2% change in your ability to think and reason and make decisions is going to impact your entire game. And so we can start to see that change with professional players, because professional players can no longer stay professional unless they're doing all these things. Otherwise, they get overtaken.
Yeah, I really liked how you mentioned how communication is such a key part of being an esports athlete, especially as a team, because, there's a bit of, I guess, an old stigma of video games where, that kids that played video games, they kind of stayed in their house. They were antisocial. It wasn't seen, I guess, as a social event or social event, I guess. And then, as multiplayer was introduced and the social aspect of it, came to the forefront. And now, where being a good team player and a good communicator actually gives you an advantage over other teams, I think, again, is just such a tremendous kind of outcome that's come from esports, is putting a value on communication and teamwork and stuff. Because, the one video game, I guess, that I play pretty consistently right now is Apex Legends with a couple of my buddies. And, when we're having, when we're in a good mood and we're talking and everything and we're communicating, our performance is so much better than, if it's super late at night, we're tired, we're not talking as much, and our performance goes down the drain.
Yeah, exactly. And I'll even argue the point that video games or esports specifically can teach communication skills faster than traditional sports, because you are always linked up with your team. Like, you've got your headset on. In traditional sports, it's very hard to hold a conversation or like say a full sentence when you're skating around a rink really fast, right? But in esports, you're stationary and you have a mic on you. So you are in constant communication. And if your communication is not crisp, clean, and clear, you're going to cause issues. And so, like when I'm working with a team, if one person does something really bad, and then everybody else starts flooding the communication lines with like blame or rage or anger or loud noises or whatever it might be, your entire team is going to start getting defensive and shut down. That's not a good thing. So you have to teach them how to react properly to a bad situation and how to communicate effectively after something bad happens, right? And so one of the rules that I have with some of the teams that I work with is that if something bad happens in game, you are required to save all blame and criticism until after the game. Because if say I die and then you start yelling at me, or vice versa, or whatever it might be, one of us is going to start shutting down. If I shut down, I communicate less or I play worse. So all forms of like criticism and blame, they can happen after the game and we can deal with it. We can sort it out. We can figure out a solution. But in the moment, you do not blame. You do not flame. You don't get angry. You just let it happen. And you let the other people focus.
Yeah, I definitely can attest to that. And, me, because I primarily just play with people that I'm close with, close friends. And I think it's harder for us to kind of bite our tongue when somebody maybe messes up and not blame the middle of the game, and to save it as maybe constructive criticism. But to that point, one thing that I would encourage, athletes to do, and I'm sure a lot of athletes already do this already, but just kind of anecdotally, what I feel is a great, performance enhancer is giving positive reinforcement in the middle of a game. Like when I'm playing Apex Legends with my team, and somebody like squad wipes, and we give them a lot of praise for it, and it's just the whole game goes better somehow. Like there's just something to positive reinforcing somebody and then seeing their performance rise. And I think that's in traditional sports and eSports, or just in life in general, that reinforcing somebody for something they did well, and they start feeling good about it, their performance just increases.
Exactly. It's like when you compliment or you praise your teammate, confidence is starting to spike, right? Like it's getting higher, and confidence is a huge predictor of success, right? Like it correlates very strongly where if somebody is confident, they're going to do better. And I think a lot of it boils down to the fact that when you're confident and you believe in yourself, you're focused on the moment and you're focused on what you need to do. So it's like in Apex, for example, sorry about that. Say you're doing great. Your teammates are pumping your tires and complimenting you. You're now focused on all right, now I have to do this. I have to do this. I have to do this. You're very on point with what needs to get done to get the win. When you start shutting down, people are flaming you and getting angry at you. You're getting more defensive now, and you're trying to focus on what not to do. You're like, okay, I can't miss this shot. I can't mess up this rotation. I can't go here. So you're now focused on all the negative things. And when just the way the brain works, when you're focused on the negative things, you gravitate towards what you're thinking. So when you're confident, you're thinking about all the positive right things to do, so you gravitate towards those. When you're in a negative headspace, you're thinking of all things you shouldn't do, so you start gravitating towards those, and you end up doing that, right? Mm-hmm. So it's like, I can't rush into this building. I'm gonna die. And then for whatever reason, it's like you turn into autopilot. You rush into that building, you die, and you're like, what did I do? I knew that was gonna happen. Why did I do that? It's because you have that gravitation towards those negative thoughts that you were thinking. And so that's one of the reasons why like pumping tires and offering praise and all that kind of stuff helps performance.
Yeah. It's kind of along another theme that I try to focus on with any of the athletes that I kind of work with, is focusing on the do's and not the don'ts, because
exactly,
it not only does it give you a positive, mind frame, I guess, or framework of your mind when you focus on the do's. But when you tell somebody not to do something, you're not telling them, and you're not really explicitly telling them what to do instead of it. So just kind of saying, that don't, let's take eSports, for example, like FIFA, for example, someone's in the 6 yard box, and you're like, don't, smash the shoot button when you're in the 6 yard boxes and go over the net or something. In that instance, it might be implied what to do instead, but you're not explicitly telling them what to do. So I always focus on doing rather than not doing when I give advice to athletes.
Exactly. And I think that kind of ties into my point too. It's like when you say what to do, you're focused on the do, and you're able to do the do. Where you focus on the don't, you often end up doing what you're not supposed to. And it's crazy just how wording and the way you communicate can impact your entire team, which is especially for in-game leaders, or like the shot callers of League of Legends or Apex or whatever it is. It's extraordinarily important that one of their primary and most extensive skills is communication, because if they can't communicate the right call or what to do, the team is doomed, right? Because the team won't understand or won't have that unity that they should.
I wonder if communication is more important for a small team or a big team, because it can kind of go either way, I guess. And probably the right answer is teamwork is important, no matter the size of the team. I kind of dug myself a little hole there, but I just kind of was thinking there, like, if you have a 3-person squad in Apex Legends compared to 20v20 ground war in Call of Duty, I wonder where teamwork would be more important. But I think the answer is it's important no matter whether it's 2 or 50 people on a team.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's easier to get 3 people doing the same thing than it is to get 10 people doing the same thing, right? Like the less minds that you have to deal with, the more likely everybody's in agreement. So if say you were hypothetically playing a game where it's 20 versus 20, more than likely after trial and error, you'd find out that in your team of 20, you need to break up into smaller squads. So it is harder to get 20 people on the same page. So I think you're right, though, that communication in small groups is probably more effective just due to the pure fact that it's easier to have two other people think the same as you.
Yeah. And I really appreciate you taking the time this evening to come on, to be able, even me being able to speak about esports in the same conversation as sports. It's pretty unreal when I think about it. Growing up, my two passions were video games and sports, and now to have them kind of merged into one as just one overarching kind of performance psychology field, I think is pretty neat. And like you, I'm sure I'm super excited for what the future of esports is. And you mentioned it already a bit, but really kind of the career options that are going to be coming from esports, just as there's ESPN and CBS Sports and stuff like that for traditional sports. I think you also know more about this than I do, and maybe there's something already out there for it, but I would assume that we're not too far off from having like just dedicated channels to esports, because there's going to be esports playing a million times a day, just like traditional sports.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there is. I believe TSN even has their own esports segment. You got like eSport Insight. You got all sorts of different kinds of channels that pump out esports stats or information, or like what trades happened or which team picked up which roster. So you already see those news outlets there, and major sporting outlets are picking up the esports ones as well.
Yeah, man. Again, thanks a lot for taking some time tonight. I really appreciate it, though.
Yeah, absolutely. No worries. Love talking about it.
Yeah.